Shalom and welcome to the Heartland Connection. This is Zach Waller, the Executive Director of Hayuvel, your host, coming to you guys straight from the Heartland of Israel. We are busy here in Israel prepping for the summer trip and harvest. Lots of prepping going on, getting housing ready, getting all of the stuff ready to roll, processing applications that are coming in, enrolling our volunteers. Lots going on here. And preparation. We've got a fundraiser going on right now, as I'm sure you've seen in the emails. So lots of detailed work going on and prep for the harvest. And it looks like it's going to be an amazing year, amazing harvest. The grape clusters are slowly ripening, and there's tons of clusters. It looks like it's going to be a bountiful harvest this year, thank God. So that's pretty much what's happening right now within Hayuvel. So we're getting ready for the harvest season, for the hundreds of volunteers coming from all over the world to come and participate in the miraculous restoration of the land of Israel. The Torah portion for this week is Beha'alotcha, which means when you kindle. And we are in Numbers chapter 8, verse 1 through chapter 12, verse 16. And this week, as I was reading through the Torah portion, I really kind of caught onto a subtle, maybe not so subtle in some places, thread throughout the entire Torah portion. It starts off in the beginning talking about the menorah, and just like a really kind of seemingly oddly placed thing in here. And then we have the consecration of the Levites and beginning the work in the tabernacle. We have this the Passover being celebrated, and the two men that come to Moshe and trying to figure out what they're going to do because they've been defiled by a corpse. We have the cloud by day and the fire by night leading the people of Israel. And we have the silver trumpets. We've got how this works in breaking camp and the whole nation of Israel moving forward. And then we have these complainers at the end, complaining about the manna, the quail coming at the very end. We have Miriam speaking evil against Moshe. And so as I was reading through all the different ones, and I had this kind of thought as I was studying and prayer time and stuff, and I was thinking about how we've kind of lost the art of being able to follow in today's culture. And I actually kind of saw this thread, and I'll go through some of these different ones and explain where I'm coming from. But it seems like in our culture today, we've got so much emphasis on being a leader. And I think that there's, for sure, part of that is a very, very good thing. I am 100% about raising up leaders, godly leaders that will lead people in righteousness and holiness. And I think that's a really, really powerful message, something that I enjoy learning about and teaching. But I think there's this thing that maybe we're kind of missing, and maybe if we really take a step back and look at where our culture's at, why are we so interested in leadership? Is it really because we want to be a good leader, or is it because we have an ego problem? Is it because everybody wants to be the superhero, everybody wants to be the guy who tells other people what to do? Everybody wants to be the top dog, right? So is that our motivation for being a leader, or do we actually want to be a leader because we want to change the world for a positive purpose to bring God's glory to the earth? And so I want to kind of look through this this Torah portion and talk about this a little bit. So early on in the portion, we have the Levites being consecrated. And this is really interesting if you kind of take a step back and look at this, because we have the Levites, who God specifically says are set apart to lead in a very specific role, right? Chapter 8, verse 14, "Thus you shall separate the Levites from among the people of Israel, and the Levites shall be mine." So again, if we step back a little bit, this is kind of interesting. The Levites are part of Israel, right? Is this saying that the rest of Israel, the other tribes, aren't gods? Is this saying that they're more special? What's going on here? This seems, if you step back a little bit, this seems a little unique. What's going on here? Separate the Levites from among the people of Israel, and the Levites shall be mine, specifically to work in the tabernacle. So basically what God has set up here is that the Levites have a specific leadership role in serving God in the tabernacle and keeping the whole nation of Israel on the right track in serving God. And later on it says like to safeguard the charge. And in verse 26, talking about the people that are over 50, says they're no longer supposed to work. They are specifically charged to safeguard the charge, it says, to make sure that this charge that's been given is maintained, that people know why they're doing it, all the different communication that needs to happen, that people know what they're doing. And we know that the Levites are supposed to be the teachers of the Torah to the rest of the nation of Israel. So they were set apart to lead in a very specific role. Okay? So I think it's very important for us to recognize that if the Levites are set aside to lead, there has to be a people that follow them, right? And that was the nation of Israel. The nation of Israel are following the Levites in their leading in this specific role. And then we have the story of the two men that were unclean by a corpse, and they couldn't celebrate Passover. They couldn't give the offering. So they come to Moshe and they ask him, okay, what do we need to do? Are we not going to be able to do this Passover sacrifice because we had to bury whoever it was became unclean by this corpse? And it's kind of interesting what goes on here too, because Moshe says, okay, let's ask God. He asks God. God says, do it a month later. In my mind, that's not a very likely verdict, right? God seems very specific about the timing of his feast, and we see later on Jeroboam moved the date to the feast, and it was a really horrible thing for Israel. So for Moshe to come back and say, well, okay, you can do it, but just do it a month later, in some ways, I'm imagining, in the Torah and in Hebrew root circles, we have a lot of debates about different, even calendar. It's a big deal. The name of God, all these different things that are talked about and argued, passionately about. And I'm just imagining if somebody went to a leader within the Hebrew roots movement and said, oh, what should we do because we can't, keep the feast? And the leader came back and said, well, just celebrate a month later. I can just imagine all of the, naysayers jumping in and saying, no, you can't do that because this. But we see here what happened. They 100% totally submitted to Moshe's verdict. And so we see that Moshe was a leader that people would submit to, and that he had a direct connection to God, and that the people of Israel followed him, even though they might not have necessarily heard the voice of God for themselves. They knew that Moshe had, and they trusted him completely with this big decision. Next, we have the cloud, right? Cloud by day, fire by night, leading the people of Israel, right? God is in this cloud, leading the people of Israel. The children of Israel are following this cloud. They are submitted to where this cloud goes. And obviously this is a very miraculous thing that's happening, and it's obvious this is God. But again, they are submitting, right? They're submitting to God's leadership through what he has put in place to follow. Next, we have the trumpets, right? Chapter 10 talks about these silver trumpets that are made. And what happens here? The trumpets are blown, and then everybody submits to that voice being put out throughout the nation of Israel. Children of Israel come in, line themselves up in an orderly rank. When they hear the sound, they move, they obey, right? And I think these words have become very negative in our culture. Submission, obedience. Like you just, hear those words and you go, ugh, you kind of cringe a little bit. It's like, I don't submit to anybody. I don't listen to what anybody says to me, but I'm ready to be a leader. If somebody listens to me, I'm in, but I'm not listening to anybody else. I think it's something we need to think through and figure out, okay, why do we have this motivation? Where are we coming from? Why do I have these feelings? And when I'm reading through this Torah portion, I'm seeing a lot of places here where God is setting up a system where there's a leader and there's a follower. And there's a lot of followers, right? There's only one leader, Moses. There's only, there's these few trumpets and the whole nation of Israel moves. one cloud by day, fire by night, and then everybody's following. And then we have the complainers, right, in chapter 11. And here's what we see what happens when people aren't good followers, right? All of a sudden they start complaining about the leadership, say, oh, why did we even leave Egypt, right? Why did we follow God? Why did we follow Moses? This shouldn't have happened. He's a bad leader, whatever. And then, obviously we had the story with the quail and everything. And then at the very end, we have Miriam speaking against Moshe, right? And then she has this crazy thing where she breaks out in leprosy. And what was going on here? She wasn't trusting Moses' discernment in his decision that he made. She wasn't following Moses' lead. She wasn't saying, okay, yeah, well, if you decided that, you're the leader, so I submit to that decision. And she broke out in leprosy because of this. Isn't some light thing. Like, she broke out in leprosy because she spoke evil against this leader, God's anointed leader. Okay. So this is a little bit uncomfortable, right? It's like, like I said, our world puts so much emphasis on leadership and these words like obedience and, submission. They really feel awkward. And even as I'm sharing this, I'm just thinking, it feels awkward. It's like, okay, how are we supposed to relate to this thing? How is this supposed to work? Because we have this feeling, and I think maybe the Germany and the Nazis, right? Maybe that's our idea of what happens when somebody just follows leadership. We think, oh, if somebody just blindly follows leadership and just does whatever they says, then that's where all these cults come from. This is how Nazism got started and took off, because people were just blindly leading, just following their leader without even thinking about what they were doing, and obviously committed horrible crimes. And I am not going to do that. I'm going to be my own person, think for myself, and make sure I don't fall into any traps like that. And that's very legitimate. And I want to make sure I make this very clear, is that I am not saying that anybody needs to follow anybody blindly, or that people don't need to think about, or question leadership. I think it's important to question leadership, but I think, especially in the Hebrew Roots movement and people who are trying to follow God in this way, and even in mainstream Christianity, submitting and obeying are like totally out of the question, right? It's like, even if it is godly leadership, we don't trust them. Or even if it is somebody who has proven that they can give good counsel, all of a sudden they tell me something that's too hard for me to do, or that I feel like I can't do, or that, maybe it's too stretching my faith too much, then, oh, well, I just go to the next place down the road, to the next church, the next congregation, whatever, and go with their leadership until something else comes up. And then, we've seen this over and over again, all these splits and stuff. And it's really heartbreaking to see. So I think maybe we've swung, the pendulum swing has gone a little bit too far. We need to come back a little bit and say, okay, there is a godly form of leadership, a godly form of submission, a godly form of obedience to godly authority. There's something here. I'm not claiming to say that I have this figured out by any means. I'm just saying, throwing it out there, saying, hey, there's something here that we need to think about. We need to look at. And it's kind of interesting. I found an article that I thought really kind of portrayed what I was thinking very well in a lot of ways. I found it on artofmanliness.com, artofmanliness.com, and the article is called "Don't Just Lead Well, Follow Well." And so I want to read a little bit of this article. I thought it was really good. It says, media and literature on leadership abound. Everywhere you look, there's another book, podcast, or motivational speech on how to become a better leader. People are clearly very interested in the topic, which isn't surprising at all. Nearly everyone is a leader in some aspect of their lives, whether at home, at work, at church, or in clubs, sports teams, or other extracurricular and civic organizations. It's a funny thing, though, given the fact that there are so many people leading out there, there must subsequently exist even more folks who are following them. And yet, almost no material, no books, no podcasts, no lectures exist on how to become a good follower. The topic is almost completely absent from education in our cultural conversation. The public's utter lack of interest in learning how to follow isn't any more surprising than its keen interest in leadership. Seeing ourselves as leaders warms our pride and enhances our sense of identity. Everyone wants to see themselves as self-sufficient, independent, iconoclast, leading the charge, marching to the beat of their own drummer, the chief, the big cheese, the head honcho. But nobody wants to see themselves as a follower. Yuck, the word crinkles the nose, leaving a bad taste in the mouth. Followers are dependent, conformist, submissive, not all like how we want to see ourselves. In our egalitarian society, everyone wishes to feel they are equal of everyone else. As much as possible, leaders and followers disguise the power dynamic that exists between them. I'll read that again. As much as possible, leaders and followers disguise the power dynamic that exists between them. Corporations and organizations emphasize the fact that everyone is a team or a family. Reality stubbornly belies this bit of theater, though. People are at least as likely, if not much more so, to be followers as leaders. After all, there are more employees than managers, more players than coaches, more readers than authors, and more students than teachers, more congregants than pastors, more believers than gods. Even if never spoken of, a hierarchy of authority and power exists in nearly every group and organization. Certain individuals have the power to give orders, make decisions, and enforce obedience, and others do not. And you do obey them, even though here again is a word we hate. You do show up on time to work and turn in your assignments on the date your professor asks and run sprints when your coach blows his whistle. Rather than be delusional and self-deceiving, we ought to own up to the fact that we all find ourselves as both leaders and followers in life, and we ought not to completely ignore the latter role in favor of the former. The fact you're a follower may be an unpleasant truth to countenance, but it's a truth nonetheless and should be faced directly. Here's another truth. Acknowledging the fact that you're a follower doesn't have to be unpleasant. Despite the cultural baggage the term has accumulated, knowing how to follow well is a mark of a superior man and leader, rather than that of sheep. Just like leadership, following effectively is a skill that can be developed and can be just as important to your success. So I thought this was really interesting and really kind of hit the nail on the head of exactly what I was talking about, is that here's this reality that we, like, everybody's a follower. And the thing that I want to say too is, obviously I'm have taken on a huge leadership role within Hayivel. I'm the executive director of this organization that's grown to be the largest volunteer organization in Israel, and we've had a lot of success, thank God. But and I'm like the executive director. I make a lot of decisions, but I'm still in submission to Dad as the founder and president. And I'm in submission to God. Like you never get to a leadership role to where you're outside of any authority or submission. I think that's sort of a lie that people believe, is that if I become the leader, I call all the shots and I don't have any responsibility. The more higher leadership responsibility you have, the more responsibility, and it's heavy. And like making decisions is not easy. It takes a lot of responsibility. So the article has a lot more to it. That was just a little bit of it, but it talked a little more about a lot of those different things and ideas. So I encourage you to read the rest of it. And again, I want to emphasize that it is very important not to follow mindlessly. We're not talking about having your what do they say, your brain being so open-minded that your brain falls out, right? We're talking about submitting to godly counsel and wisdom and instruction. And we actually see that in our Bible, in the New Testament. Excuse me. In Hebrews chapter 13, verse 17, it says, "Obey." There's that word, obey. Obey your leaders and submit to them. Ouch. Now, when's the last time that you heard of somebody being totally obedient to leaders and submitting to their leaders? It's right here in the Bible. Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls as those who will have to give an account. These guys are serious. So obviously it's talking about godly leaders here. Keeping watch over your souls as those who will have to give an account. Let them do this with joy and not with groaning, for that would be of no advantage to you. Don't give them a hard time. Obey your leaders and submit to them. Wow, this seems pretty straightforward. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 15. Look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of the time, because the days are evil. Therefore do not be foolish, but understand that the will of the Lord is. And do not get drunk with wine, for that is debauchery, but be filled with the Spirit, addressing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody to the Lord with your heart, giving thanks always and for everything to God the Father in the name of our Lord Yeshua Messiah, submitting to one another out of reverence for Messiah. Submitting to one another. Wow, look at this. And then obviously we have the scriptures about wives submitting to their husbands, and this has obviously been a huge thing that a lot of people have so many discussions about. But it's even mentioned 3 times: Ephesians 5, 1 Peter 3, Colossians 3, 3 times in the New Testament. Wives, submit to your own husbands. It's the Bible. It's written here. There is a place of submission here in the scripture that we can't ignore in a lot of different levels. And then obviously the biggest one, submitting ourselves to God. James chapter 4, verse 7, submit yourselves therefore to God. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. So we have this setup where God is trying to help us realize that we need to have submission. And in almost every spiritual thing, there's a physical thing to help us understand the spiritual thing. So how are we ever going to be able to know what submitting to God means if we can't submit to people on earth, to our fellow man, to our neighbor, to our children to parents, wives to husbands, husbands to leadership and elders? Like, God has set this up for a reason. Like, it's important for us to find that place of submission so that we can truly know how to submit to God. One of the places in the Old Testament, Jeremiah chapter 35, talk about the Rechabites, who they submitted to their father, and God blessed them for that, even though he said some pretty interesting things that you could easily biblically argue against. The Rechabites submitted to their father and were blessed for it. So, being in submission, following, it's critical for all believers, for believers in God, as Christians, as people that believe in Yeshua the Messiah. We have to find this place of being a follower and submitting. And the article that I was mentioning earlier actually goes on to talk about how following is the road to leadership. And I would like to even say maybe even more than that as a follower, you begin taking on leadership, and you might not all of a sudden be the top dog all of a sudden, whatever. And that's not the way it works. As I was saying earlier, you always have somebody that you're submission to. So following is just, following without being a leader won't last long. If you're a good follower, you will soon be leading in different ways, and it will slowly grow and grow and grow. And you may be, if you're really good at following and all the different things I don't have time to go into about that, you will become a great leader. And like I said, it's very, very obvious. Children, they must be in submission to their parents. Scripture talks about that. Wives submitting to their husbands, men submitting to leadership, leadership submitting to elders, elders submitting themselves to God, and submitting themselves to the community, right? The elders have to be in touch with the community and be, it's not like anybody has a way out of being accountable. Elders have to be accountable too. And that's one big reason why I really respect my dad, is because he doesn't try to step there and make out big, orders and decisions. He's very submitted to the community, to his children, his sons. We're always talking about things. And one last thing I want to mention is I think we can even consider Israel, right? Israel as God's firstborn, as a leader in the nations, right? And I think that many of the nations are resistant. Our whole culture is so resistant to this firstborn, this leader thing. Maybe that's why Israel is having so much trouble in the world today as a nation. I think we need to recognize these leadership places and follow God's ways in these things. So, out of time. Thanks so much for listening, and Shabbat Shalom from the beautiful, exceedingly good land of Israel.